Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Picture this. It's a Friday night in the summer of 1975, and you're standing on the corner of Woodward Avenue and Grand Boulevard in Detroit, Michigan. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep purple. The air is thick and warm, carrying with it the smell of hot asphalt, fried food from the corner restaurant, and a hint of motor oil that seems to hang permanently over this city of cars. A burgundy Pontiac GTO rumbles past, its engine growling low and powerful, chrome bumpers catching the last rays of sunlight. The driver has his window down, and from inside comes the unmistakable sound of Marvin Gaye's voice, smooth and yearning, singing about what's going on in this complicated world. Three young women wait at the bus stop, their bell-bottom jeans swaying as they move to music only they can hear, platform shoes adding inches to their height, afros picked out to perfection, catching the evening breeze. Across the street, the lights of a club are just starting to flicker on one by one, neon signs promising music, dancing and escape. You can already hear the bass line thumping from inside, feel it in your chest, even from out here on the sidewalk. In a few hours, that place will be packed with bodies moving together, sequins catching disco ball light, creating a galaxy of stars on the dance floor. This is Detroit in the 1970s, the Motor City, Motown, a place of contradictions so striking they take your breath away. This is a city that gave the world some of its most beautiful music, where assembly lines hummed with the promise of prosperity, where neighborhoods pulsed with life and culture. But this is also a city standing at a crossroads, facing changes so profound they would reshape not just Detroit but the entire American landscape. In this decade, Detroit would lose its most famous export when Motown Records packed up and headed west to Los Angeles. The city would elect its first black mayor in a campaign so racially charged it felt like the entire future hung in the balance. The auto industry, the very foundation upon which this metropolis was built, would face its first real crisis, as foreign cars and oil embargoes exposed vulnerabilities nobody wanted to acknowledge. Underground drug operations would evolve into sophisticated corporate empires run by teenagers. Disco would explode from underground clubs into mainstream consciousness, and through it all, the people of Detroit would live, love, struggle, dance, work, and fight to hold on to their city. Tonight, we're going to walk those streets together. We're going to step into the homes, the factories, the clubs, and the corners where life actually happened. We're going to meet the auto workers clocking in for the night shift, the musicians creating sounds that would change music forever, the activists demanding justice, the families trying to build better lives, and yes, the dealers and gangsters who saw opportunity in chaos. We're going to taste the food, hear the music, feel the fashion, and understand what it really meant to live through one of the most transformative decades in American urban history. This isn't just a story about decline, though decline is part of it. This isn't just about crime, though crime is part of it too. This is the full story, complex and contradictory, beautiful and brutal, exactly as it was lived by the people who were there. This is what they don't always tell you about 1970s Detroit, so settle in, get comfortable, and let's step back in time together to a city that was falling apart and coming alive all at once, to a decade when everything changed, to the Detroit that existed in the space between the dream and the reality. When the 1970s began, Detroit was still, on paper at least, one of America's great cities. The census takers counted approximately 1.5 million souls within the city limits, making it the fifth largest city in the entire United States. Only New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Philadelphia had more people. The skyline was dominated by impressive Art Deco towers built during the boom years, monuments to the wealth that had flowed through this city when it was the undisputed capital of the automotive world. But numbers on a census form don't tell you what a place feels like, what it sounds like, what it means to the people who live there. And by 1970, Detroit was a city carrying heavy burdens from its recent past while trying to figure out what its future might hold. The summer of 1967 still cast a long shadow. That July, the city had erupted in what was then the deadliest race riot in American history. It started with a police raid on an unlicensed bar, what locals called a blind pig, on 12th Street in a predominantly black neighborhood. What followed was 5 days of destruction that left 43 people dead, over 1,000 injured, and entire city blocks burned to the ground. The National Guard had patrolled the streets in armored vehicles. From the air, smoke rising from burning buildings made Detroit look like a war zone. 3 years later, the physical scars were still visible, empty lots where buildings had stood, businesses that never reopened. The psychological scars ran even deeper. Trust between the black community and the police department had been fractured, maybe beyond repair. The riot, or rebellion, depending on who was telling the story, had accelerated a process that was already underway: white flight to the suburbs. Throughout the 1960s, white families had been leaving the city in waves, moving to places like Warren, Livonia, Dearborn, and the other suburbs that ringed Detroit. By 1970, the city's population was approaching 50% black, a dramatic shift from just 2 decades earlier. This wasn't a gentle, gradual change. This was a rapid transformation that affected everything from politics to education to the economy to the very character of neighborhoods. You could see this transformation playing out on nearly every residential block. A family would move out, their house would sit empty for a few months, then a new family would move in. Sometimes the transitions were smooth. More often they were accompanied by tension, by fear, by the ugly machinery of blockbusting, where real estate agents would deliberately stoke racial anxiety to drive down property values and facilitate rapid neighborhood turnover. The automotive industry, the economic engine that made everything else possible, was facing challenges it had never encountered before. For decades, American car manufacturers had dominated not just the domestic market, but much of the world market. The big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, had operated with the confidence that came from near-total market control. Their factories employed hundreds of thousands of workers in Detroit alone. The River Rouge plant, Ford's massive complex in Dearborn just outside the city, had employed over 90,000 workers at its peak, making it one of the largest industrial facilities on the planet. But by 1970, imports were starting to make serious inroads. Volkswagen Beetles and buses had developed a devoted following. Japanese manufacturers like Toyota and Datsun were beginning to show up in American driveways, praised for their fuel efficiency and reliability. The big three dismissed these as insignificant threats, tiny cars that would never appeal to the American love affair with size and power. That dismissal would prove costly. The 1970 model year saw the peak of the muscle car era, those powerful machines with big engines and bigger attitudes. The Pontiac GTO, the Chevrolet Chevelle, the Dodge Challenger, cars that could go from 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds, cars that made a statement just sitting at a stoplight. But the muscle car boom was about to run headlong into an energy crisis nobody saw coming. Walk through a Detroit neighborhood in 1970, though, and you wouldn't necessarily feel the anxiety about what was coming. You'd feel life. The streets were the stage where daily existence played out, especially in the warmer months. Front porches weren't just architectural features, they were living rooms open to the world. On any given evening, you'd find people sitting out, talking to neighbors, watching kids play, commenting on who was walking by. Children owned the streets in a way that's hard to imagine today. They'd play elaborate games that spanned multiple blocks, kickball and tag and hide and seek. They'd set up makeshift ramps and jump them on their bikes. The ice cream truck's musical jingle would send them running home for money, then sprinting back to catch it before it turned the corner. There was a freedom to it, born from the assumption that the community itself was watching, that every adult on the block had some measure of responsibility for every child. The car culture that defined Detroit wasn't just about what rolled off the assembly lines, it was about what people did with those cars once they owned them. Cruising was an art form. On weekend nights, Woodward Avenue would become a parade route, young people showing off their rides, some stock from the factory, others customized with paint jobs, chrome details, lifted suspensions, or dropped low to the ground. The cars were more than transportation. They were expressions of identity, markers of style, investments of time and money and love. The architecture of the city told its own story. There were the grand old mansions along streets like Boston Boulevard, built by automotive barons in the early decades of the century, now often subdivided into apartments. There were the tidy bungalows and two-story homes of working-class neighborhoods, many with small front yards and one-car garages out back. There were apartment buildings from various eras, some quite elegant, others purely functional. And there were the commercial strips, blocks of storefronts with apartments above, the ground floor occupied by grocery stores, barbershops, beauty salons, bars, restaurants, dry cleaners, all the businesses that made neighborhood life possible. The visual landscape still reflected Detroit's glory days. The Guardian building downtown, completed in 1929, stood as a jewel of Art Deco architecture, its facade a riot of colorful terracotta tiles. The Fisher Building, another Art Deco masterpiece, dominated the New Center area with its golden tower. These buildings spoke to a time when Detroit saw itself as one of the world's great cities, when money and ambition combined to create something beautiful and lasting. But beauty and decay existed side by side, sometimes on the same block. An ornate theater might stand next to a building with boarded-up windows. A thriving corner store might be across from an empty lot filled with weeds and broken glass. The juxtaposition was jarring, this sense that the city was simultaneously still vital and already in the early stages of something darker. The people were what made Detroit real. They got up every morning and went to work, whether that work was on an assembly line, in an office, at a hospital, in a classroom, or running a small business. They came home and made dinner, helped kids with homework, watched television, listened to the radio, read the newspaper. They went to church on Sundays, whether that was a Baptist church with gospel music that shook the walls, a Catholic mass in Polish or Italian, or one of the many other houses of worship that reflected Detroit's incredible diversity. This was a city of immigrants and migrants. Poles and Italians and Greeks and Irish had come in earlier waves. African Americans had come north during the Great Migration, fleeing Jim Crow and seeking opportunity. Middle Eastern communities, particularly Chaldean Catholics from Iraq, were growing. There were neighborhoods where you could walk for blocks and hear half a dozen different languages, smell food from around the world, see signs in various scripts. That diversity created both richness and tension. Different communities sometimes lived parallel lives, intersecting at work or in commercial districts, but remaining largely separate in their social and religious and family lives. And the racial divide between black and white was becoming the dominant fact of Detroit life, affecting politics, schooling, policing, housing, everything. As 1970 turned into 1971 into 1972, the signs of change multiplied. More businesses closed, more houses sat empty. The crime rate was rising, fed by poverty, by the drug trade, by the desperation that comes when opportunity seems to be evaporating. The auto plants were starting to automate, slowly at first, replacing workers with machines. It was the beginning of a process that would reshape the entire industrial landscape. But understanding what was coming doesn't mean the people living through it knew. For many, life still felt stable, predictable. You worked your shift, you collected your paycheck, you paid your mortgage, you took care of your family. The union protected your job. The pension waited at the end. The American dream, as it had been sold to millions of workers, still seemed achievable if you worked hard and played by the rules. Detroit in the early 70s was a city standing at a crossroads, though many of the people walking its streets didn't realize they were about to choose a path or have a path chosen for them that would change everything. The music was still playing, the factories were still humming, the streets were still full of life, but underneath the surface, seismic shifts were building, pressure accumulating, ready to reshape the landscape in ways nobody could fully predict. Morning in a working-class Detroit neighborhood began before sunrise for many families. The alarm clock would go off at 4:30 or 5, depending on which shift you worked. The man of the house would roll out of bed, his wife usually getting up with him to make breakfast before he left. The smell of coffee percolating on the stove, bacon sizzling in a cast-iron pan, toast browning in the toaster. Quick, practical meals to fuel a long day of physical labor. By 5:30, the streets would start filling with cars, all heading in the same direction, toward the massive factory complexes that dominated the landscape. The River Rouge plant in Dearborn was its own city, sprawling across over 1,000 acres. At its peak in the late 40s, it had employed over 90,000 workers. By the 70s, that number had dropped, but it was still enormous, still employing tens of thousands. Other plants dotted the area: Chrysler's Dodge Main, GM's various facilities, dozens of smaller operations making parts and components. The shift change was a ritual, a tide of humanity flowing in one direction as another tide flowed out. Men and women, though the factory floor was still overwhelmingly male, carrying lunch pails and thermoses. Some carpooled to save on gas, others drove alone, cherishing those minutes of solitude before the noise and intensity of the factory day began. The parking lots around the major plants stretched for what seemed like miles, seas of metal glinting in the early morning light. Inside the plants, the work was demanding, repetitive, loud, and sometimes dangerous. The assembly line moved at a steady pace, never stopping, never slowing down. Each worker had their station, their specific task that they would repeat hundreds of times per shift: installing door panels, tightening bolts, welding joints, installing windshields, mounting wheels. The work required focus, but not much thought, which meant your mind could wander even as your hands stayed busy. The noise was constant, overwhelming: the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the roar of machinery, the beep of forklifts backing up. Conversation was difficult, sometimes impossible. Workers developed their own sign language, their own ways of communicating over the din. Earplugs were essential, but not always used, leading to hearing loss that many older workers carried as a badge of their years on the line. The United Auto Workers Union was at the height of its power in the early 70s. Contracts negotiated in the late 60s and early 70s had secured wages and benefits that made auto workers solidly middle class. A worker at a Big Three plant could make enough to buy a house, support a family, own a car or two, take a modest vacation each year. The union had won them health insurance, retirement pensions, cost of living adjustments. These weren't gifts from benevolent corporations, they were hard-won victories from strikes and negotiations and the solidarity of workers standing together. But there was a price. The work was mind-numbing. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year of the same motions could break something in a person's spirit. Many workers counted down the years until retirement, the 30 years of service that would earn them a pension, the golden ticket out. Some managed to find satisfaction in the work, in doing their job well, in the camaraderie with fellow workers. Others just endured, drinking heavily after shifts to numb the tedium and exhaustion, their bodies breaking down from the repetitive strain. Away from the factories, domestic life followed familiar patterns. The wives of auto workers often didn't work outside the home, at least not when children were young, though that was starting to change by the mid-70s as economic pressures increased. They managed households which in that era meant substantial labor, cooking from scratch, cleaning, laundry, shopping, managing the family budget, raising children. The work was unpaid and often unacknowledged, but it was no less demanding than factory work. The kitchen was the heart of most homes. Meals were family affairs when possible, everyone sitting down together at the dinner table. The food reflected Detroit's diversity. In Polish households, you might have pierogies and kielbasa. In Italian homes, homemade pasta and red sauce that simmered for hours. In black families, soul food, collard greens and cornbread, fried chicken and sweet potato pie, recipes carried north from the south during the Great Migration. In Greek households, moussaka and spanakopita. In Chaldean homes, dishes from Iraq, rice and lamb, and flatbreads. Shopping happened at a mix of locations. The big grocery stores were moving out to the suburbs following the population. In the city, people often relied on smaller stores, corner markets that were more expensive but within walking distance. Hudson's department store downtown was still operating in the early 70s, a massive building that took up an entire city block where families would go for big purchases, clothes for school, furniture, appliances. Shopping there was an event, not just a transaction. Children's lives revolved around school, church, and unstructured neighborhood play. The schools in Detroit were facing enormous challenges in the 70s. The flight of middle-class families, both white and increasingly black, was draining resources. A court case about school segregation that began in 1970 would drag on for years, exposing the deep divisions in how the city and suburbs approached education. Many city schools were underfunded, overcrowded, struggling with aging buildings and limited supplies, but school was still school. Kids learned their reading and math and history. They participated in sports and clubs. They formed friendships and rivalries. They navigated the complex social hierarchies of adolescence. The dress code was changing rapidly in the 70s. The strict rules of earlier decades were giving way to more freedom. Boys could wear their hair longer. Girls could wear pants instead of skirts. Platform shoes were everywhere, adding inches to everyone's height. Bell-bottom jeans were standard issue. The wider the flare, the better. High school culture in Detroit was vibrant and varied. Football games on Friday nights under the lights, the bleachers packed with students and parents. Basketball games in overheated gyms, the squeak of sneakers on hardwood, the roar of the crowd. School dances in the cafeteria or gymnasium, transformed with decorations and dim lights, where kids would dance to the latest hits from the radio. The music of Motown and soul, and the emerging disco sound. The youth fashion was bold and expressive. For young black students, the afro was not just a hairstyle but a political statement, a rejection of standards that said black hair needed to be straightened to be acceptable. Dashikis and African-inspired prints connected to a broader movement of black pride and consciousness. Platform shoes weren't just for disco. They were everyday wear, adding swagger to the walk to class. Gold chains and hoop earrings, wide belts and platform boots. The style was about visibility, about refusing to blend in. For white students, the fashion was also evolving, influenced by the hippie movement and the glam rock scene. Longer hair for boys, often to their shoulders, which drove their parents crazy. Tie-dye shirts and denim jackets covered in patches. Girls wore peasant blouses and long skirts, or tight tops with bell-bottoms. The divisions were often visible in style choices, different groups claiming different aesthetics as markers of identity. Sunday mornings had a different rhythm. Church was central to community life for many Detroit families. The Black Baptist churches were known for their powerful gospel music. choirs that could raise the roof, preaching that was equal parts theology and social commentary. Services could last for hours, but nobody seemed to mind. It was spiritual refreshment and social connection combined, a place to see friends, catch up on news, feel part of something larger than yourself. The Catholic churches served various ethnic communities, often in their native languages. Polish churches, Italian churches, each maintaining traditions from the old country while adapting to American life. The Chaldean Catholic community, immigrants from Iraq, had their own parishes where services incorporated Middle Eastern traditions. These churches were more than places of worship. They were cultural anchors, preserving language and customs and identity. Block parties and neighborhood gatherings were common, especially in summer. Someone would block off the street with their cars, set up tables and grills, and the whole block would come out. Kids would run wild, playing games and riding bikes. Adults would grill hamburgers and hot dogs, set out potato salad and coleslaw and baked beans. Someone would bring a radio or portable stereo, and music would provide the soundtrack. These gatherings were informal, spontaneous, the kind of community building that happened naturally when people knew their neighbors and felt invested in their street, their block, their small corner of the city. Front porches were outdoor living rooms in good weather. You'd sit out in the evening, watching the world go by, waving to neighbors, commenting on the weather. It was a way of being both private and public, at home but still engaged with the community. Older residents would sit in their spot, a particular chair they'd claimed, and hold court, dispensing wisdom or gossip, or both, to anyone who passed by. The corner store was another vital institution. Not a chain, but a family-owned business, often open long hours where you could get milk and bread and canned goods, cigarettes and candy, cold pop from the cooler. The owners knew their customers by name, kept a mental tab of who owed what, knew which kids were likely to try to shoplift, and watched them carefully. These stores weren't just commercial enterprises, they were social spaces, places where news spread, where you ran into people, where the pulse of the neighborhood could be felt. For entertainment, people watched television, the three major networks offering their lineup of shows. Families would gather around the set for popular programs. The radio was always on somewhere, playing the hits. Detroit had legendary radio stations, DJs who were local celebrities, who broke new records and created the soundtrack for the city. WJLB, the black-oriented station, was hugely influential, helping spread the Motown sound, and later the disco and funk that would dominate the decade. Life in Detroit neighborhoods in the early 70s was working class but not necessarily struggling, at least not for those with union jobs. There was a sense of stability, of having a place in the world, even if that place involved hard work and limited horizons. People took pride in their homes, in keeping their lawns mowed and their houses painted, in the small improvements they could afford to make. But underneath that surface stability, changes were accumulating. The jobs that had seemed secure were becoming less so. The neighborhoods that had seemed permanent were changing rapidly. The social fabric that had held communities together was starting to fray under the pressure of economic transformation and racial transition. People could feel something shifting, even if they couldn't always name what it was or predict where it would lead. In the early months of 1970, if you walked down West Grand Boulevard in Detroit and found yourself at number 2648, you'd encounter an unassuming two-story house with a bold sign declaring it Hitsville, USA. This was the headquarters of Motown Records, Berry Gordy's empire of soul, the place where some of the most important music in American history had been created. The building wasn't impressive from the outside. It was just a house, converted into a recording studio and office space, wedged between other buildings in a neighborhood that was definitely not glamorous. But what had happened inside those walls over the previous decade had changed the landscape of popular music forever. The Supremes, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, The Four Tops, Martha and the Vandellas, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Jackson 5. The list of artists who had recorded there read like a who's who of soul and R&B. Berry Gordy had founded the company in 1959, starting with $800 borrowed from his family. His vision was clear and revolutionary: create music by black artists that would appeal to both black and white audiences, music that could cross the rigid racial boundaries that defined so much of American life. He wanted to create a sound that was sophisticated and polished, music that would be played on white radio stations and purchased by white teenagers, breaking down barriers through the universal language of melody and rhythm. The operation was modeled on the auto assembly lines that dominated Detroit. Gordy had worked at a Ford plant and understood the efficiency of breaking a complex process into specialized tasks. At Motown, songwriters specialized in writing, producers in producing, musicians in playing, and artists in performing. The Holland-Dozier Holland songwriting team cranked out hit after hit with remarkable consistency. The Funk Brothers, the studio musicians who played on most Motown recordings, were some of the most talented and underappreciated musicians in America, their contributions largely unknown to the general public. The Motown sound was distinctive and carefully crafted. The bass lines were prominent and melodic, often carrying the hook of the song. The rhythm section was tight and precise, influenced by jazz but simplified for pop accessibility. Strings and horns added sophistication. And above it all, the vocals, often featuring intricate harmonies, call and response patterns borrowed from gospel, and lead singers with unmistakable voices. By 1970, Motown had conquered the charts. In the entire decade of the 60s, the label had placed more than 100 songs in the top 10 of the pop charts. No other record company, regardless of size or resources, could match that success. Berry Gordy had taken a dream and $800 and built an empire that generated millions in revenue and immeasurable cultural influence. But success brought complications. The biggest artists were chafing under the Motown system, which was notoriously controlling and gave artists little creative freedom or ownership of their work. Gordy ran the company with an iron fist, making all major decisions, controlling not just the music, but the image, the choreography, the wardrobe, everything. For many artists, especially as they matured and developed their own artistic visions, this felt suffocating. The most dramatic example of this tension came with Marvin Gaye and the album that would become What's Going On. Gaye had been one of Motown's most reliable hitmakers throughout the 60s, smooth and sophisticated, the kind of singer mothers approved of their daughters' liking. But by 1970, Gaye was going through personal turmoil and wanted to make music that reflected the social upheaval he saw around him. He brought Berry Gordy a song called What's Going On, co-written with Ronaldo Benson and Al Cleveland. The song addressed war, poverty, police brutality, environmental destruction, all the issues that were tearing America apart in the early 70s. It was jazz-influenced, atmospheric, with multiple vocal layers and a sound completely unlike the typical Motown single. Gordy hated it. He thought it was uncommercial, too political, too different from the Motown formula. He refused to release it. Gaye went on strike, refusing to record anything else for Motown until they released What's Going On. The standoff lasted months, but finally, in early 1971, Gordy relented. The single was released in January and shot to number 2 on the pop charts, selling over 100,000 copies in its first day. It was a massive hit, proving Gaye's instincts right and Gordy's wrong. Emboldened, Gaye recorded an entire album built around similar themes, using the same layered, sophisticated production approach. The What's Going On album was released in May 1971 and became one of the most critically acclaimed albums in music history, addressing social issues with a maturity and artistry that redefined what was possible in popular music. But its success also highlighted the tension at the heart of Motown between artistic vision and commercial formula. Other artists were also pushing against the boundaries. Stevie Wonder, who had been with Motown since he was 11 years old, recording as Little Stevie Wonder, was turning 21 in 1971. When he came of age, he gained control of the money Motown had been holding in trust for him, millions of dollars from years of hit records. He also demanded and received unprecedented creative control, building his own studio and producing his own albums. The music he made in the early 70s, albums like Music of My Mind and Talking Book and Inner Visions, was experimental and personal, using synthesizers and drum machines, addressing politics and spirituality, proving that Motown artists could be more than hit-making machines. Meanwhile, the nightlife venues where Motown artists had honed their craft were still operating, though changes were coming there too. The 20 Grand Club on 14th Street and Warren Avenue was legendary in Detroit music circles. It had opened in the early 50s and quickly became the premier black entertainment venue in the city. The building was huge, featuring a 22-lane bowling alley on the ground floor and multiple performance spaces upstairs. The main showroom was called the Driftwood Lounge, and it could hold over 1,000 people. The decor was meant to evoke a tropical paradise, with artificial palm trees and nautical themes. The stage featured rotating platforms and elaborate lighting. This was where Motown artists performed regularly when they weren't on tour, where new acts would test material, where established stars would do special shows for hometown crowds. The audiences at the 20 Grand were dressed to impress. This wasn't a casual jeans and t-shirt crowd. Men wore suits, often with coordinated shirts and ties, their shoes polished to a high shine. Women wore elegant dresses, their hair styled in elaborate updos or smoothed and straightened, makeup applied with care, jewelry catching the light. Going to the 20 Grand was an event, an opportunity to see and be seen, to participate in a scene that felt sophisticated and adult. The performers delivered shows, not just concerts. The Temptations would glide across the stage in perfect synchronization, their choreography as important as their vocal harmonies, every move rehearsed and polished. The Supremes would appear in matching gowns, often sequined and shimmering, their presentation as important as their singing. This was show business in the classic sense, entertainment designed to dazzle and impress. But by 1972, the music industry was changing in ways that would prove fatal to Motown's Detroit era. Berry Gordy had been spending more and more time in Los Angeles, attracted by the entertainment industry concentration there, by the better weather, by the opportunity to expand into film and television. The decision had been building for years, but in 1972, Motown officially relocated its headquarters to Los Angeles. The move devastated Detroit's music community. Musicians who had played on countless hits suddenly found their services no longer needed. Songwriters and producers were told they could move to LA or find new work. The city that had created the Motown sound was losing the label that bore its name. It felt like a betrayal, an abandonment, one more piece of Detroit's identity being stripped away. The building on West Grand Boulevard became a museum of sorts, a reminder of what had been but was no more. Some Motown artists, particularly those who were Detroit natives, were angry about the move. Others understood the business logic but felt the loss nonetheless. The era of Hitsville, USA, of that impossible concentration of talent in one unassuming building, was over. The ripple effects extended beyond the people directly employed by Motown. The label had been an anchor for Detroit's cultural identity, proof that the city could produce not just cars but art, that black creativity could conquer the commercial mainstream, that Detroit mattered on a global cultural stage. Without Motown, without that engine of hit-making and star-making, what was left? Other labels tried to fill the void. Holland Dozier Holland, the legendary songwriting team who had left Motown in a royalty dispute, had started Invictus Records and Hot Wax Records in Detroit. They had some success with acts like Chairman of the Board and Freda Payne. Westbound Records, run by Armand Baladian, became home to Parliament and Funkadelic, George Clinton's psychedelic funk collectives. But none of these labels had the consistent hit-making power or cultural influence of Motown in its prime. For the musicians who stayed in Detroit, the 70s became about adaptation. Studio work dried up as recording moved to other cities. Some musicians transitioned to teaching, passing on their skills to a new generation. Others formed bands and played the club circuit, making a living from live performance rather than session work. Some left music entirely, finding work in the auto plants or other industries, their talent buried under economic necessity. The Motown that remained in Detroit existed primarily in memory and in the music that still played on the radio. Those songs, though, the songs were immortal. Every time a DJ spun I Heard It Through the Grapevine or My Girl or Ain't Too Proud to Beg or Baby Love or Stop. In the name of love, Detroit's contribution to American culture was reaffirmed. The records didn't die when the company left town. The music remained, evidence of what had been created here, a reminder that Detroit had given the world something beautiful and lasting. But the absence was felt. The creative energy that had centered around Motown dispersed, some of it following the label to Los Angeles, some finding new channels in Detroit, some simply dissipating into the general economic and social challenges the city faced. The story of Motown leaving Detroit is often told as pure tragedy, and there's truth to that. But it's also a story about the inevitable tension between art and commerce, between local loyalty and global ambition, between staying put and reaching for something bigger. Berry Gordy made the choice that made sense for his business. Detroit was left to deal with the consequences. In the underground clubs of Detroit in the early 70s, something new was happening, a sound and a scene that would eventually explode into mainstream consciousness and change the landscape of popular music. Disco was being born, not all at once, but gradually, in spaces that existed on the margins, in communities that mainstream society often ignored or actively rejected. The Chessmate Lounge on Woodward Avenue, near 6 Mile Road, was one of the epicenters of this emerging culture. It was a gay club serving primarily black gay men in an era when being openly gay required courage and created danger. The club itself was modest, not fancy or large, but what happened inside its walls was revolutionary. This was where people could be themselves without fear, where music and dance created a space of freedom and joy in a world that often offered neither. The Chessmate featured DJs who were pioneering a new approach to dance music. Instead of live bands, which were expensive and took breaks, DJs would play records continuously, mixing them together so that one song flowed seamlessly into the next, keeping dancers on the floor for hours. This wasn't just playing songs randomly, it was an art form, reading the crowd, building energy, creating musical narratives that took people on journeys. Ken Collier was the godfather of Detroit's disco scene. He was a black gay DJ who had an encyclopedic knowledge of music and an intuitive understanding of how to move a crowd. Collier didn't just work at the Chessmate, he had residencies at multiple clubs throughout the 70s, spreading the disco gospel across Detroit's nightlife landscape. He was known for his incredible record collection, built through years of digging through record stores and trading with other DJs. He had music nobody else had, tracks imported from Europe, unreleased promotional copies, obscure labels, treasures found in the bins of shops that didn't know what they had. What made disco different from the soul and funk that preceded it wasn't just the continuous mixing, but the sound itself. Disco took elements from multiple genres and blended them into something new. The foundation was funk and soul with those prominent bass lines and rhythmic guitar work, but disco added lush string sections, often borrowed from classical music traditions, creating a sophistication and elegance that elevated the dance floor. Horns added punctuation and excitement, and the beat, the famous four-on-the-floor beat with its steady kick drum on every quarter note, created an irresistible pulse that made it almost impossible not to move. The early disco records that were moving Detroit crowds in the early 70s included the Love Unlimited Orchestra's Love's Theme, with its sweeping orchestral arrangement. The Hughes Corporation's Rock the Boat, with its infectious groove. MFSB's TSOP, The Sound of Philadelphia, which would become the theme song for Soul Train, the television show that brought black music and style into millions of living rooms every weekend. These songs were joyous and energetic, designed not for passive listening but for active participation on the dance floor. By the mid-70s, disco was spreading beyond the underground gay clubs into a broader nightlife scene. The Factory on Jefferson Avenue became another Ken Collier residency, a larger venue that drew mixed crowds. When Studio 54 in New York would close at 2 in the morning, partygoers who wanted to keep dancing would head to the Factory, which stayed open until dawn. The club had a reputation for being a place where anything could happen, where social boundaries dissolved in the heat and sweat of the dance floor. Other clubs joined the scene: Famous Door, The Escape, Backstreet, Menjo's, Todd's on 7 Mile, Club Fever on 6 Mile, and Woodward. Each had its own character, its own crowd, its own vibe. Some were more upscale, with strict dress codes and velvet ropes. Others were grittier, welcoming anyone with the cover charge. But they all shared the common language of disco, that propulsive beat and soaring strings that promised escape and transcendence. The fashion at these clubs was spectacular. Disco demanded visual impact to match the musical intensity. For women, it meant dresses that caught the light, often covered in sequins that would shimmer and flash as they moved. Metallic fabrics were huge, silver and gold lame that looked like liquid metal. Halter tops that showed off shoulders and backs, platform shoes that added 4 or 5 inches of height, making everyone taller, changing the geometry of the body and the attitude of the walk. Hair was often straight and long, inspired by Cher and Diana Ross, or teased up high, defying gravity. Makeup was bold, bright eyeshadow in blues and greens and purples, glossy lips, dramatic eyelashes. For men, the disco look was equally bold, wide collar shirts worn unbuttoned to mid-chest, revealing chains and chest hair. Tight pants that showed off the body, often in bold colors or patterns. Platform boots for men too, chunky heels that added height and swagger. 3-piece suits in materials that had a sheen to them, catching the disco ball light. Gold chains and medallions, hair grown out longer, styled with care, afros picked out to impressive dimensions, or straightened and flowing. The centerpiece of any disco was the disco ball, that mirrored sphere that hung from the ceiling and spun slowly, scattering points of light across the room and the dancers. When the lights dimmed and the disco ball started spinning, when the bass line kicked in and the strings soared, when the floor filled with bodies moving together, there was a magic to it, a feeling of being part of something larger than yourself. The dancing itself was becoming more structured. Early disco dancing was freestyle, people inventing their own moves, but as the scene grew, specific dances emerged. The hustle became hugely popular, a partner dance that involved intricate turns and dips and coordination. Lines would form on the floor, everyone doing the same moves in unison, the precision and synchronization creating visual spectacle to match the music. Disco was about more than music and fashion and dancing, though. It was about freedom and inclusion in a way that was radical for its time. The disco scene welcomed people regardless of race or sexual orientation, creating integrated spaces in a city and a country still deeply divided. On the disco floor, a black gay man could dance next to a straight white woman, and nobody cared. What mattered was the music, the moment, the shared experience of joy and release. This inclusivity wasn't without tension. Mainstream America was watching disco's rise with suspicion and often outright hostility. The association with gay culture made disco a target for homophobia. The prominence of Black and Latino artists made it a target for racism. The focus on pleasure and sensuality, the sexual liberation that disco spaces represented, made it a target for those who saw the 70s as a decade of moral decay. But in the clubs, none of that mattered. The music was too loud, the beat too strong, the collective energy too powerful for outside judgment to penetrate. Ken Collier wasn't just playing records, he was building community. He shared his knowledge generously with younger DJs who were learning the craft. He sold records from his personal collection out of his house, helping other DJs build their libraries. He created a network of people connected through music, through the shared experience of those nights when the music was perfect and the crowd was right and everything aligned into something approaching transcendence. By the late 70s, disco would become a global phenomenon, commercialized and diluted in the process of going mainstream. But in those early and mid-70s clubs in Detroit, disco was still underground, still pure, still a scene where the outcasts and the avant-garde were creating something genuinely new. The people dancing at the Chessmate or The Factory weren't thinking about music history. They were living their lives, finding joy and connection, expressing themselves through movement and fashion and participation in a scene that welcomed them. Disco in Detroit was also preparation for what would come next. The DJ culture that disco established, the focus on electronic beats and continuous mixing, the idea of the DJ as artist and curator, all of this would feed directly into Detroit's next major musical innovation, techno. But that was still years away. In the mid-70s, it was all about the disco beat, the shimmer of sequins, the spin of the disco ball, and the feeling that for a few hours at least, in the right club with the right music, you could be exactly who you wanted to be. While music played and people danced, another story was unfolding on Detroit streets, one darker and more dangerous than anything happening in the clubs. The drug trade was changing, evolving from small-time operations into sophisticated criminal enterprises that would reshape the city's underworld and have profound effects on daily life for ordinary residents. In the early 70s, Detroit's drug trade was still largely controlled by the Italian mafia, also known as the Detroit Partnership. This was the traditional organized crime structure that had roots going back to Prohibition, when bootleg alcohol made fortunes for men willing to break the law. The mafia had adapted over the decades, moving from alcohol to gambling to drugs as opportunities changed. Heroin was the profitable commodity now, and the Italian bosses controlled the supply lines and distribution networks. Murder Row emerged in 1974 as a faction within the Italian mafia structure. It was founded by Big Frank Nitti Usher, who had a close relationship with Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, one of the top bosses in the Detroit Mafia. This connection was significant because the Italian mob had traditionally been suspicious of working with black criminals, but Nitti and Tony Jack had developed a mentorship relationship that crossed those traditional racial lines. Murder Row specialized in heroin distribution, operating primarily through a network of street-level dealers, while the organizational leadership remained well insulated from direct drug handling. Chester Campbell served as the principal enforcer, the muscle that kept discipline within the organization and terror in the hearts of anyone who might consider competing or testifying. The operation was profitable and violent, using fear as a business tool just as much as they used supply and demand. The arrest of Chester Campbell in 1975 marked a turning point. Without its primary enforcer, Murder Row struggled to maintain the tight control, it had exercised over its territory and its members. Internal conflicts erupted, rivals sensed weakness and moved in. Within a relatively short time, Murder Row diminished significantly as a force in Detroit's drug trade, but the vacuum it left behind would be filled by something even more innovative and ultimately more destructive. Eddie "Fat Man" Jackson was operating independently during this same period, though he allegedly had connections to the Gambino crime family in New York. Jackson represented a new type of criminal figure in Detroit, a black man who had built significant wealth through the heroin trade and wasn't shy about displaying it. He lived lavishly, drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, mingled with celebrities and athletes, acting as though his drug money was as legitimate as any other fortune. Jackson, along with Courtney Brown, was among the first major individual black drug dealers to emerge in Detroit, separate from the Italian mafia structure. They were paving the way, proving that it was possible to operate large-scale drug operations without being part of the traditional organized crime hierarchy. Their success attracted attention from law enforcement, but it also served as inspiration for younger entrepreneurs who saw the drug trade as one of the few paths to wealth available to them. The law enforcement response to rising crime focused heavily on street-level enforcement, particularly targeting black neighborhoods. In 1971, the Detroit Police Department created a unit called STRESS, which stood for Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. On the surface, it sounded like a reasonable response to a crime problem. Detroit had recorded 23,000 robberies in 1970, an enormous number that created genuine fear in many neighborhoods. Something had to be done. But STRESS quickly became notorious for its aggressive tactics and the high body count it produced. The unit operated as a decoy operation, with plainclothes officers posing as vulnerable targets, drunks or drug users or elderly people trying to lure criminals into attempting robberies so they could be arrested or, more often, shot. The officers were given enormous latitude in their operations and little oversight in how they conducted them. In less than 3 years of operation, STRESS officers killed 22 people. Almost all of the victims were young black men or boys. The circumstances of many of these shootings were highly questionable. The official reports would claim the officers were defending themselves, that the suspects were armed and dangerous, that force was necessary. But witnesses often told different stories, and the pattern was undeniable. STRESS had become what community activists called it, an execution squad, a terror operation targeting black youth under the guise of crime prevention. The anger this generated in Detroit's black community cannot be overstated. Parents were terrified to let their teenage sons out of the house, knowing that an encounter with STRESS could prove fatal even if the young man had done nothing wrong. The unit became a symbol of police brutality and racial injustice, a rallying point for activists demanding change. Protests calling for STRESS's abolition grew larger and more frequent. The issue became central to Detroit politics and would play a crucial role in the 1973 mayoral election. For ordinary residents trying to navigate daily life, the increasing violence and police aggression created impossible situations. You needed to be aware of which streets were controlled by which groups, where drug dealing happened openly, which corners to avoid. You needed to teach your children how to interact with police in ways that might keep them safe, which meant compliance and submission even when the police were wrong, because asserting your rights could get you killed. Neighborhood boundaries became more important and more rigid. Territory that had once been simply where you lived became contested space, areas claimed by different groups for different purposes. A corner that had been a place where kids played might become known as a drug corner, transforming the entire block's character. Residents would try to reclaim these spaces through block clubs and community organizing, taking turns sitting outside to monitor activity, calling police when they saw dealing happening, trying to maintain some sense of safety and normalcy. But calling the police wasn't always a solution. The relationship between the police and many Detroit neighborhoods was poisoned by years of brutality and racism. Many residents didn't trust the police to help them, feared that police intervention might make things worse, or worried about being labeled a snitch if they were seen talking to officers. This erosion of trust between police and community would have long-lasting effects, making it harder to address crime effectively and creating a vacuum that criminal organizations could exploit. The drug trade itself was evolving. Heroin remained the primary commodity, but the market was expanding and diversifying. More people were using, including users from suburban areas who would come into the city to buy. The profits were enormous, enough to fund lifestyles that must have seemed impossible to young people who saw legitimate employment offering only dead-end jobs with low pay and no future. The drug economy became a shadow system running parallel to the legitimate economy, offering its own opportunities and rewards to those willing to accept the risks. Violence was an inevitable part of this economy. Disputes over territory, over debts, over betrayals, real or perceived, all of these got settled with weapons. Drive-by shootings became more common. Young men started carrying guns routinely for protection or for aggression, depending on the situation. The homicide rate in Detroit was climbing, reflecting not just the drug trade but the broader breakdown of social cohesion and the desperation that came with economic decline. For families living in neighborhoods affected by the drug trade, daily life required constant vigilance and adaptation. You learned to recognize the signs of drug houses, the steady stream of visitors arriving and leaving quickly, the lookouts posted on corners, the expensive cars that didn't match the surrounding poverty. You taught your children to come straight home from school, not to linger on corners, not to get curious about what was happening in that house down the street. You hoped and prayed that the violence wouldn't touch your family directly, while knowing that stray bullets didn't respect good intentions or innocent lives. The psychological impact of living in this environment was profound. Chronic stress from feeling unsafe in your own neighborhood, trauma from witnessing violence or knowing someone who had been killed, grief that became so common it was almost normalized. Many residents developed a hard shell, a way of moving through the world that protected them emotionally but also closed them off from connection and vulnerability. Children growing up in this environment learned lessons about the world that no child should have to learn, about how life could be cheap, about how violence could come suddenly and senselessly, about how the people who were supposed to protect you often did the opposite. Yet, even in neighborhoods deeply affected by crime and drugs, life went on. People still went to work, still took care of their families, still found moments of joy and connection. Block clubs organized cleanup days, painting over graffiti, picking up trash, trying to maintain pride in their community despite the challenges. Churches provided not just spiritual guidance but practical support, food pantries and tutoring programs and safe spaces for kids. Extended families looked out for each other, taking in cousins or nieces who needed a safer environment, pooling resources to help someone get through a tough time. The story of Detroit's streets in the mid-70s is not just about crime and decline, it's also about resilience and resistance, about communities fighting to survive and maintain their humanity in the face of forces that seemed designed to destroy both. The people living through this weren't just victims, they were active participants in their own lives, making choices within constrained options, finding ways to create meaning and purpose, even when the structures around them were failing. The 1973 mayoral election in Detroit wasn't just another political contest. It was a referendum on the city's future, on who would have power and whose interests would be prioritized. The two candidates represented fundamentally different visions, and everyone knew it. The campaign was bitter, divisive, and openly about race in ways that politicians usually tried to obscure. Coleman Alexander Young was the black candidate, though he was much more than that simple description suggests. He had been born in Alabama in 1918 but came to Detroit as a child during the Great Migration. his family seeking better opportunities in the industrial North, like hundreds of thousands of other black families. He had worked in the auto plants, experienced firsthand the discrimination that black workers faced. He had been a union organizer during the militant days of the 30s and 40s, when unions were fighting for recognition and workers were risking their jobs and sometimes their lives to organize. He had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in the early 50s during the Red Scare and had refused to cooperate, telling the committee to go to hell in colorful language that became legendary. Young had entered politics in the 60s, serving in the state Senate, where he developed a reputation as a skilled legislator and a fierce advocate for civil rights and social justice. He understood how power worked, how to build coalitions, how to push for change within the system while maintaining his radical edge. By 1973, he had the support of most of Detroit's black political establishment, the church leaders and community organizers and labor unions that formed the base of black political power in the city. John Nichols, the white candidate, was the police commissioner, a position that had given him high visibility during the stress years. Nichols was the architect and defender of stress, convinced that aggressive, no-nonsense policing was what Detroit needed to control crime. He ran a law and order campaign using coded language about crime and safety that everyone understood was really about race, about containing and controlling the black population, about maintaining white authority in a city that was becoming a majority black. The election split along stark racial lines. In the primary, Young had advanced along with Nichols, defeating other candidates to set up the general election showdown. Both candidates tried to appeal across racial lines, at least superficially. Young talked about his policies in race-neutral terms, focusing on economic development, city services, police reform. Nichols tried to suggest his support came from concern about crime, not racism. But nobody was fooled. This was about race, about power, about what kind of city Detroit would become. The campaign got ugly. Nichols' supporters spread fear about what would happen if Young won, suggesting the city would descend into chaos, that white people wouldn't be safe, that property values would collapse. Young supporters countered that Nichols represented continued police brutality and systematic racism, that black residents would never get fair treatment under his leadership. The Detroit Police Officers Association, the union representing rank-and-file cops, enthusiastically endorsed Nichols, seeing him as their protector against the reforms that Young was promising. On Election Day in November 1973, Detroit's racial divide was reflected in the voting booth. Young won 92% of the black vote. Nichols won 91% of the white vote. The difference was that Detroit's population was nearing the tipping point, close to 50% black, and black voter turnout was exceptionally high, energized by the possibility of electing the city's first black mayor. Young won by a narrow margin, around 14,000 votes out of over 450,000 cast. But a win was a win. The inauguration in January 1974 was historic. Coleman Young became the first black mayor of Detroit, taking office in a city deeply divided, facing enormous challenges, with expectations sky-high from supporters and fear-mongering from opponents. His inaugural address was memorable for its directness and defiance. He promised to reform the police department, to make it responsive to all residents, not just some. He promised economic development, better services, a government that worked for everyone. Then he issued his famous warning to criminals and corrupt cops alike. I issue an open warning now to all dope pushers, to all rip-off artists, to all muggers. It's time to leave Detroit. Hit 8 Mile Road. 8 Mile Road was the northern boundary of the city, the dividing line between Detroit and the suburbs. Young was telling criminals to get out. But then he added the kicker that sent shockwaves through the police department and throughout white Detroit. And I don't give a damn if they're black or white, or if they wear superfly suits or blue uniforms with silver badges. Hit the road. Equating criminals in superfly suits, a reference to the blaxploitation film and the flashy style associated with street hustlers, with corrupt police officers in uniform was inflammatory. It was direct. It was exactly what Young's supporters wanted to hear, and what his opponents feared. He was serving notice that the old ways were over, that the police department would be held accountable, that badges wouldn't protect officers who abused their power. Within 6 weeks of taking office, Young issued Executive Order No. 2, abolishing stress. The unit that had terrorized black neighborhoods for 3 years was dismantled immediately. For many residents, this alone justified their support for Young. The relief was palpable. Parents felt marginally safer letting their children walk to school. Young men breathed a little easier walking down the street. The fear that any encounter with plainclothes cops might turn deadly was lifted, at least from that particular source. But abolishing stress was just the beginning of Young's planned police reforms. His vision was more comprehensive, transform the overwhelmingly white police department into one that reflected the city's racial demographics. At the time Young took office, less than 10% of Detroit police officers were black in a city that was nearly 50% black. Young set an ambitious goal, 50% black officers by 1978, just 4 years away. To achieve this, Young implemented aggressive affirmative action policies. For every white officer hired or promoted, a black officer would also be hired or promoted. This quota system was controversial and would face legal challenges, but Young was committed to it. He believed, with good reason, that a police force that looked like the community it served would be more trusted and would police more fairly. He also implemented residency requirements, mandating that police officers live within the city limits. Many white officers lived in the suburbs and commuted into Detroit for work. Young had called them an army of occupation during the campaign, and now he was telling them they had to live in the city if they wanted to keep their jobs. The intention was to give officers a stake in the community, to make them neighbors to the people they policed, to break down the US versus them mentality that had poisoned police-community relations. The Detroit Police Officers Association fought back hard against these reforms. The union was predominantly white and conservative, and they saw Young's policies as attacks on their members. They filed lawsuits challenging the affirmative action policies, arguing reverse discrimination. They organized protests and slowdowns. The union president made inflammatory statements attacking Young personally. The battle between the mayor and the police union would define much of Young's first term and create ongoing tension throughout his tenure. Young also created a network of mini police stations throughout the city, small command posts embedded in neighborhoods rather than concentrated in large precinct buildings. The idea was community policing, making officers more accessible and visible, integrating them into the fabric of neighborhood life. He set up neighborhood city halls, small offices where residents could access city services and file complaints without having to travel downtown. These initiatives were meant to make government more responsive and accountable. The response to Young's reforms split along predictable lines. In black neighborhoods, there was hope and support, a sense that finally someone in power was listening to their concerns and taking their needs seriously. In white neighborhoods, especially on the Far East and West sides where white residents still predominated, there was fear and anger, a sense that Young was anti-white, that he was favoring one group over another, that the city was being taken away from them. The reality was more complicated than either perspective fully captured. Young was trying to address legitimate grievances about police brutality and discrimination while also dealing with real crime problems that affected all Detroiters, black and white. He needed to reform the police to gain community trust, but he also needed effective law enforcement to address crime. These goals weren't necessarily contradictory, but achieving both simultaneously proved incredibly difficult. The white exodus from Detroit accelerated during Young's tenure, though it's debatable how much of that was caused by his policies versus broader economic and social forces that were already in motion. White residents who had been considering moving to the suburbs made that move faster. Others who might have stayed decided to leave. The racial tipping point that had been approaching when Young took office accelerated, and within a few years, Detroit would be a majority black city, the first major American city to cross that threshold. Young's relationship with the white business establishment was pragmatic. Despite his radical past and his fiery rhetoric, once in office, he understood that he needed business cooperation to address the city's economic challenges. He called what he termed an ideological truce, working with corporate leaders on downtown development projects, trying to attract investment, supporting initiatives like the Renaissance Center that he hoped would revitalize the city's economy. This pragmatism disappointed some of his more radical supporters who wanted revolutionary change, not accommodation with capitalist elites. But Young understood something crucial. A mayor's power, even a mayor in a large city, is limited. He couldn't stop white flight or prevent businesses from moving to the suburbs or reverse the broader economic forces that were reshaping American cities. He could try to manage the decline, to reform institutions like the police that were under his direct control, to provide services to residents who remained, to maintain some measure of hope that Detroit had a future. Whether those efforts would be enough remained to be seen. The significance of Young's election extended beyond Detroit. He was one of several black mayors elected in major cities in the early 70s as black political power grew in urban areas where demographic changes had created black majorities or near majorities. Cleveland, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Newark, and other cities would follow similar patterns. Young became a symbol, proof that black people could attain the highest levels of municipal power, that the civil rights movement's political goals could be achieved, at least in theory. But the challenges these new black mayors faced were enormous, perhaps insurmountable. They were inheriting cities in decline, cities losing population and tax base, cities with aging infrastructure and social problems exacerbated by federal disinvestment and suburban flight. They were being handed the reins of power just as that power was being drained of its resources and capacity. It was, in some ways, a hollow victory, control of institutions that were already failing. For the residents of Detroit watching Coleman Young take office, though, the symbolism mattered. Seeing a black man in the mayor's office, hearing him speak truth to power, watching him stand up to the police union and the old guard, all of this created a sense of possibility, a feeling that maybe things could change, that maybe the system could be made to work for them instead of against them. That hope, even if it would later be disappointed, was real and significant in the moment. In October 1973, halfway across the world, a decision was made that would send shockwaves through Detroit and change the American auto industry forever. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, declared an oil embargo against nations that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The United States was at the top of that list. Almost overnight, the price of oil quadrupled. Gas shortages followed immediately. For Americans accustomed to cheap, abundant gasoline, the embargo was a shock to the system. Long lines formed at gas stations, sometimes stretching for blocks. Drivers would wait for hours just to fill their tanks if the station hadn't already run out of fuel. Rationing schemes were implemented, allowing people to buy gas only on certain days based on whether their license plate ended in an odd or even number. The entire country was forced to confront something it had taken for granted: unlimited mobility at cheap prices. For Detroit, the crisis exposed a vulnerability that the auto industry had been ignoring for years. American cars were big, powerful, and spectacularly inefficient. Muscle cars that got 8 or 10 miles per gallon were status symbols, marks of power and freedom. Family sedans weren't much better, most getting somewhere in the teens for fuel economy. This hadn't mattered when gas was cheap, but when prices shot up and supplies became uncertain, suddenly those gas guzzlers looked like liabilities rather than assets. The foreign imports that American manufacturers had dismissed as insignificant suddenly became very attractive. The Volkswagen Beetle, mocked by some as a silly little car, got 30 miles per gallon or better. Japanese cars like the Toyota Corolla and Datsun 510 were small but efficient, reliable, and affordable. Sales of imports surged during and after the embargo, as Americans discovered that maybe bigger wasn't always better, that maybe fuel efficiency mattered more than they had realized. The big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, scrambled to respond. They rushed to develop smaller, more fuel-efficient cars to compete with the imports. But designing and manufacturing cars takes years. You can't just flip a switch and transform a company that has spent decades building big cars into one that builds small ones. The tooling, the supply chains, the expertise, everything was oriented toward large vehicles. Making the shift would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Meanwhile, the embargo's effects rippled through Detroit's economy. Auto sales dropped sharply as consumers worried about fuel economy and general economic uncertainty. When sales drop, production drops. When production drops, workers get laid off. The layoffs started as temporary, the plants shutting down for a few weeks to let inventory catch up with demand. But as the crisis dragged on, the layoffs became longer, more extensive. Thousands of workers found themselves unemployed, their savings dwindling, their futures suddenly uncertain. The United Auto Workers Union, which had seemed invincible just a few years earlier, found itself in a defensive position. The contracts negotiated in the early 70s had won important gains for workers. In 1970, the union had secured a provision known as 30 and out, which meant workers could retire with full pensions after 30 years of service, regardless of their age. For workers who started at 18, that meant retiring at 48 with a pension and health care for life. It seemed like a great victory at the time, a reward for decades of hard labor. But those generous benefits were predicated on continued profitability and growth, assumptions that were being challenged by the oil crisis and foreign competition. The big three were suddenly looking at declining market share, higher costs, and fierce competition from manufacturers who had lower labor costs and newer, more efficient factories. The golden age of auto worker prosperity was ending, though few people recognized it yet. The economic anxiety was palpable in working-class Detroit neighborhoods. Families who had felt secure suddenly weren't. The automatic overtime that had padded paychecks was gone. The certainty of steady work evaporated. Arguments about money became more common as household budgets got tighter. The stress of unemployment or reduced hours took a toll on marriages, on mental health, on the social fabric of communities built around stable industrial employment. But the problems ran deeper than just the oil embargo. American auto manufacturers had become complacent during their decades of dominance. Quality control had slipped. Consumer complaints about defects and reliability were rising. The joke about American cars breaking down became common enough that it wasn't really a joke anymore. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturers were building reputations for quality and reliability, using new manufacturing techniques and quality control processes that American companies dismissed as gimmicks or propaganda. The plants themselves were aging. Many of Detroit's auto factories had been built in the early decades of the 20th century. They were massive, impressive for their time, but increasingly outdated compared to modern facilities being built elsewhere. Automation was coming, slowly at first, but accelerating, as companies realized they could reduce labor costs and improve consistency by replacing workers with robots. This was just beginning in the 70s, but it portended massive disruption to come. Union leadership was trying to navigate an impossible situation. Workers expected the union to protect jobs and maintain benefits. Management was demanding concessions, arguing that labor costs were making American cars uncompetitive. The union had to decide whether to fight for everything and risk driving companies into bankruptcy, or to compromise and risk betraying the workers they represented. Neither choice was good. Amid all this economic turmoil, Detroit's civic and business leaders were trying to project confidence and optimism. The Renaissance Center, Henry Ford II's massive downtown development project, was moving forward. Groundbreaking had happened in 1973, and construction was proceeding on the complex of 7 skyscrapers that would tower over the riverfront. Ford and other business leaders promoted the Renaissance Center as proof that Detroit had a future, that downtown could be revitalized, that the city could transform itself into a modern service economy. The project cost over $500 million, making it one of the largest private developments in American history. The centerpiece was a 73-story hotel, the tallest in the world at the time, surrounded by 4 39-story office towers. It was meant to be a city within a city, with shops and restaurants and conference facilities and direct access to the riverfront. The architecture was modernist and imposing, designed to make a statement that Detroit was still important, still relevant, still capable of building monuments. But there was a disconnect between the vision of the Renaissance Center and the reality on the streets. The development was downtown, separated from most residential neighborhoods. It was oriented toward business travelers and conventions, not toward ordinary Detroiters. The hope was that this investment would spark broader revitalization, but many residents saw it as a fortress, a protected enclave for the wealthy while their neighborhoods deteriorated. The Ren-Sen, as it came to be called, would open in 1977, and time would tell whether it could fulfill its promise. Another major project was moving forward in the late 70s, a new sports arena to replace the aging Olympia Stadium, where the Detroit Red Wings had played hockey since 1927. The Olympia was in a neighborhood that had declined significantly, and the facility itself was showing its age. The new arena, which would be called Joe Louis Arena after the famous Detroit boxer, was being built on the riverfront downtown adjacent to Cobo Hall, the convention center. Construction began in 1977 with an opening planned for 1979. These big projects were meant to signal renewal and optimism, but they couldn't mask the underlying problems. The auto industry crisis was about more than just one oil embargo. It was about a fundamental shift in global competition, about the end of American manufacturing dominance, about the beginning of deindustrialization that would transform cities like Detroit from production centers into something else, though nobody was quite sure what that something else would be. Families who had built their lives around auto industry jobs were facing existential questions. If the plants closed permanently, what would they do? Where would they work? Should they stay in Detroit and hope for recovery, or should they leave, move to the Sun Belt where jobs were supposedly more plentiful, start over somewhere else? These weren't easy decisions. Most people had extended family in Detroit, social networks, church communities, deep roots. Leaving meant abandoning all of that, becoming strangers in a new place. But staying meant accepting uncertainty and possible poverty. The psychological impact of this economic disruption was profound. Men who had defined themselves by their work, who took pride in being providers, found their identities shattered when the plants closed. Depression became common, though rarely acknowledged or treated. Domestic violence increased as stress and frustration sought outlets. Alcohol abuse rose. These were the hidden costs of deindustrialization, the human toll that didn't show up in economic statistics but was no less real for that. For younger people just entering the job market, the landscape was completely different than what their parents had experienced. The assembly line jobs that had offered middle-class wages and benefits weren't available anymore, or weren't available in the same numbers. Service sector jobs, retail and fast food and hospitality, paid far less and offered fewer benefits and no security. The path to the American dream that had seemed so clear to the previous generation was blocked, or at least much harder, to navigate. Yet even in crisis, some found opportunity. The economic disruption created space for new thinking, new approaches. Small businesses emerged to fill niches that had been ignored by larger companies. Some workers used severance pay or savings to start their own operations, repairing cars or doing contracting work or opening small shops. Entrepreneurship born from necessity rather than opportunity, but entrepreneurship nonetheless. The story of Detroit's auto industry in the 70s is often told as simple decline, and there's truth to that narrative, but it's also a story about adaptation, about resilience, about people trying to navigate massive changes while maintaining their dignity and their dreams. The crisis revealed weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but it also showed the strength of communities and families who refused to give up, who kept fighting for their city and their future even when the odds seemed overwhelming. By the late 1970s, the street-level drug trade in Detroit was undergoing a transformation that would have profound implications for the city, for law enforcement, and for a generation of young people who saw opportunity where others saw destruction. A new organization was emerging that would revolutionize the heroin trade and become one of the most successful and notorious drug operations in American history. Young Boys Incorporated, known as YBI. The story begins with 4 young black men who grew up in the same Northwest Detroit neighborhood, the Dexter-Davison area, and who had watched the drug trade operate for years, studying its mechanics, understanding its vulnerabilities, seeing where improvements could be made. Raymond Peoples, who went by Baby Ray, was one of the founders, known for his business acumen and strategic thinking. Milton Jones, called Butch, would become the organization's de facto leader after getting out of prison, bringing a military discipline and ruthless efficiency. Mark Marshall, known as Block, was another founding member, and Dwayne Davis, nicknamed Wonderful Wayne, rounded out the original leadership. What made YBI revolutionary wasn't just who they were, but how they structured their operation. The traditional drug organizations, including the Italian mafia that had long controlled Detroit's heroin trade, used adult dealers at all levels. This made them vulnerable to law enforcement because adults could be prosecuted aggressively, facing long prison sentences that often made them willing to cooperate and testify against higher-ups in exchange for reduced sentences. The YBI founders had a brilliant insight that sounds almost too obvious once you hear it. Use juveniles. Kids under 18 couldn't be prosecuted as adults, faced much lighter penalties if caught, and were less likely to become informants because they were less afraid of the juvenile justice system. It was strategic brilliance and moral monstrosity combined, turning children into the front line of a criminal empire while insulating the adult leadership from direct exposure to law enforcement. The organizational structure was sophisticated, based on corporate models rather than traditional street gang hierarchies. At the top were the 4 founders, insulated from day-to-day operations by multiple layers of management. Below them were lieutenants, responsible for specific territories or functions. Below the lieutenants were crew leaders, managing teams of street-level dealers, almost all of whom were teenagers, some as young as 13 or 14. It was a vertical integration that would have made Henry Ford proud if he'd been alive to see it, and could have gotten past the product being sold. The name itself, Young Boys Incorporated, was chosen carefully. Young Boys identified the demographic being recruited. Incorporated signaled that this was a business, a professional operation, not just a street gang. The branding was sophisticated, creating an identity that appealed to young people who saw few other paths to respect and financial success. YBI wanted independence from the traditional power structures, so they sourced their heroin directly from the Golden Triangle, the region where the borders of Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar meet, one of the world's major opium-producing areas. And this wasn't easy or cheap, but it freed them from dependence on the Italian mafia, which had long controlled drug importation into Detroit. By going directly to Southeast Asian suppliers, YBI could get better quality product at lower prices and couldn't be cut off if they angered the traditional mob bosses. The territory YBI claimed was the Dexter-Davison neighborhood on Detroit's northwest side, but they quickly expanded their operations across much of the city. By the late 70s, they controlled an estimated 80% of Detroit's heroin market, an astonishing market share. Their daily sales were estimated at $300,000, over $2 million per week, more than $100 million per year. These numbers are almost impossible to verify precisely, but even if they're inflated, the scale of the operation was clearly enormous. Part of what made YBI so successful was the quality control and branding. Unlike many drug operations that cut their product heavily to maximize profits, YBI maintained relatively high purity levels and branded their heroin with specific names that became known for quality. This created customer loyalty in a market where reputation mattered. Butch Jones reportedly tested product personally with trusted users before releasing it for sale, ensuring consistency. The organization had rules, strict rules, that were enforced ruthlessly. Members of the crew were not allowed to use the products they sold. This prevented the descent into addiction that destroyed many drug dealers and kept the workers reliable. Territory boundaries were clearly defined and defended. Dealers were expected to be on their posts during assigned hours, treating it like any other job. The entire operation ran with a professionalism that was startling and disturbing. Enforcement was handled by what was called the Wrecking Crew, a group of enforcers led by Butch Jones, who dealt with anyone who violated the rules or threatened the organization. If you stole money or product, if you talked to police, if you tried to leave the organization, if you competed in their territory, the Wrecking Crew would find you. The violence they inflicted was meant to send messages, to create a climate of fear that kept everyone in line and discourage competition. Competitors were eliminated, sometimes literally, if they couldn't be scared off. For young people in Detroit's poorest neighborhoods, YBI represented something powerful and alluring. It was a way to make money, real money, more money than any legitimate job available to a teenager with limited education would ever pay. It was a way to gain respect, to have status, to be somebody instead of nobody. Wearing nice clothes, having cash in your pocket, being part of something that seemed powerful and successful. These things mattered in communities where so much seemed hopeless. The tragedy is that it was all built on destruction. Every dollar YBI made came from addiction, from people who couldn't stop using heroin, even as it destroyed their lives, their health, their families. The neighborhoods where YBI operated became drug markets, with all the violence and degradation that entailed. Families were torn apart. Children grew up in homes where parents were addicts, where basic needs went unmet because money went to drugs, where violence was a constant threat. The money flowing through YBI didn't build anything or create anything of value. It extracted wealth from the poorest communities and concentrated it in the hands of a few while leaving devastation in its wake. But YBI didn't just operate in Detroit. The organization expanded to other cities, applying the same model that had proven so successful at home. Boston was their most successful franchise, with operations that reportedly generated $70,000 per day in sales. The young men sent to Boston to set up and run these operations brought the Detroit playbook with them, recruiting local youth, establishing territories, replicating the structure that worked. YBI was becoming a national organization, a blueprint that other groups would study and copy. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. The traditional approaches to fighting drug organizations, which relied on catching dealers with drugs and flipping them to testify against their bosses, didn't work well against YBI. The juvenile dealers who got caught faced minimal consequences and weren't willing to testify. The organizational structure made it difficult to connect street-level arrests to the leadership, and the sheer volume of the operation, the number of people involved, the sophisticated methods they used, all of it represented a step change in the drug trade that police weren't prepared to handle. Federal authorities began to take notice. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, they started investigating YBI as the organization's success, and the violence it generated made national news. Young Boys Incorporated was becoming infamous, a symbol of how bad things had gotten in Detroit, how sophisticated and brazen the drug trade had become. But building a case that would hold up in court and actually take down the leadership would take time, resources, and some luck. For the young people recruited into YBI, the organization was a trap disguised as opportunity. Yes, you could make money, more money than flipping burgers or working retail, or doing any of the other low-wage jobs available to teenagers in poor neighborhoods. But the life expectancy was short. You could get killed by rivals, by police, by your own organization if you broke the rules. You could get addicted to the very drugs you were selling. You could get arrested and, even if you were a juvenile, still end up in the justice system, starting a cycle of incarceration that would define the rest of your life. And even if you succeeded, if you made money and survived, what then? The money was illegitimate, couldn't be used openly without attracting attention. The skills you developed, street skills, organizational skills, weren't transferable to legitimate employment, and the psychological toll of participating in an operation that caused so much harm, even if you rationalized it or ignored it, left scars that many would carry forever. The rise of YBI in the late 70s represented a failure of society to provide legitimate paths to success for young people in poor urban neighborhoods. When the choice is between a minimum wage job with no future and a drug operation offering real money and status, it's easy to see why some would make the choice that from the outside seems clearly wrong. The young men who joined YBI weren't monsters. They were people responding to the incentives and opportunities presented to them in an environment that offered precious, few, good options. The story of Young Boys Incorporated is about more than just drugs and crime. It's about economic desperation, about structural inequality, about the failure of institutions, about communities under siege, about the human cost of deindustrialization and urban decline. The organization didn't create the problems in Detroit, it exploited them, profited from them, and made them worse. But understanding why YBI was able to rise and thrive requires looking at the bigger picture, at everything that had happened to Detroit throughout the 70s, at the accumulated weight of white flight and job loss and police brutality and school segregation and political dysfunction and federal disinvestment. YBI was a symptom as much as a cause, though that distinction mattered little to the lives it destroyed. While crime and economic decline dominated one narrative of late 70s Detroit, another narrative was playing out in the city's nightlife, a story of music and fashion and dancing and joy, of people determined to live and enjoy life even amid, or perhaps especially because of, the chaos surrounding them. The late 70s were in many ways the peak of Detroit's disco-era nightlife, a time when the clubs were packed, the music was incredible, and the party seemed like it might never end. The Grande Ballroom on Grand River Avenue on the west side had been a legendary rock venue since the late 60s, where bands like MC5 and Iggy and the Stooges had played shows that were as much revolution as entertainment. By the mid-70s, the venue was hosting a mix of rock and emerging punk shows, continuing to be an important space for live music even as disco was taking over the dance clubs. Baker's Keyboard Lounge maintained its position as Detroit's premier jazz club, a title it had held since opening in 1933. The club was small and intimate, with the piano actually built into the bar, in an innovative design that put the performers right in the middle of the audience. This was where serious musicians played, where the art form was respected and celebrated. If you wanted to see world-class jazz in a setting that honored the music's history and importance, Baker's Keyboard Lounge was where you went. But for the masses of young people looking for a place to dance and party and escape the pressures of daily life, the disco clubs were the destination. The scene that had started underground in gay clubs in the early 70s had exploded into mainstream consciousness. Disco was everywhere by the late 70s, on the radio, in movies, in fashion, dominating popular culture in ways that seemed both natural and sudden. The clubs themselves were spectacles. The Factory, still operating with Ken Collier often behind the decks, had established itself as an essential stop for serious dancers. The sound system was powerful, the dance floor was large, and the crowd was mixed and vibrant. The Chessmate continued to serve its community, a safe space in a world that wasn't always safe. Club Fever, The Escape, Backstreet, Menjo's, dozens of venues across the city offered their own variations on the disco experience, each with its own identity and crowd. Walking into one of these clubs on a Saturday night was an immersive experience. The bass from the music system would hit you first, physically, making your chest vibrate with every kick drum hit. Your eyes would need a moment to adjust to the darkness punctuated by flashing colored lights, strobes, and the gentle rotation of the disco ball scattering points of light like stars across the ceiling and walls and dancing bodies. The fashion on display was extraordinary. This wasn't people wearing their everyday clothes to go dancing. This was fashion as performance, as art, as statement. The women looked like they'd stepped out of magazine spreads, dresses made of materials that caught every light source, sequined patterns that created shifting geometric designs as they moved, halter tops that showed off shoulders and backs paired with high-waisted pants that emphasized curves, platform shoes that were works of engineering, adding 4 or 5 inches of height while somehow remaining danceable. Hair that had been carefully styled, sometimes straight, and flowing down backs like silk, other times teased up into gravity-defying structures. The makeup was theatrical, dramatic, eyeshadow in blues and greens and purples and golds, colors that popped under the club lights, false eyelashes that made eyes look huge and expressive, glossy lips, often in pinks or reds or even darker colors. The whole presentation was about visibility, about standing out, about creating a look that demanded attention and appreciation. The men were equally bold in their fashion choices. The days of conservative suits and ties were long gone. Disco fashion for men was about peacocking, about displaying confidence and style. Shirts with wide collars, often worn unbuttoned halfway down the chest or lower, revealing gold chains and chest hair. The fabrics were shiny, satiny, catching light as men moved across the dance floor. Tight pants that showed off physiques in colors and patterns that would have seemed outrageous in any other context, but here were just part of the scene. Platform shoes for men too, adding height and changing the geometry of movement, creating a distinctive walk that had swagger built into it. Bell-bottom pants were still popular, though they were evolving, sometimes combined with the tighter fits above the knee that would eventually lead to the next decade's fashion. Three-piece suits were having a moment, but these weren't your father's business suits. These were in bold colors, in materials that had sheen, cut to emphasize the body rather than hide it. And the accessories, the gold chains and rings and watches, the medallions and bracelets, The statement belts with elaborate buckles, all of it adding up to a complete look that said, "I'm here, look at me, I'm somebody." The dancing itself had evolved significantly from the freestyle movement of earlier years. The hustle was the dominant partner dance, involving intricate turns and dips that required coordination and practice. On crowded dance floors, couples would navigate the space expertly, their movements synchronized, the lead and follow dynamic creating visual poetry. Line dances would spontaneously form, everyone doing the same moves in unison, the collective precision creating its own kind of beauty. But there was still room for freestyle, for individual expression, for people who wanted to dance alone or in groups rather than with partners. The good dancers, the ones who really knew how to move, would claim space on the floor, and others would back up to watch and appreciate the show. These dancers were athletes and artists combined, their bodies capable of movements that seemed impossible, their sense of rhythm so precise that they never missed a beat, their creativity in interpreting the music making each dance a unique performance. The music itself was getting more sophisticated and diverse. The simple disco tracks of the early 70s had evolved into complex productions with layers of instrumentation, extended versions that built and released tension over 8 or 10 or 12 minutes, taking dancers on journeys. Philadelphia International Records was producing lush, orchestral soul that worked perfectly for disco dancing. Funk bands were incorporating disco elements, creating fusion that satisfied dancers and music purists alike. And Detroit artists were contributing too. George Clinton's Parliament Funkadelic Collective was creating music that defied easy categorization. Funk and rock and soul and disco all mixed together with sci-fi imagery and social commentary and pure, unadulterated groove. Hamilton Bohannon, a Detroit native and drummer, had hits like Foot Stompin' music that perfectly captured the energy and joy of the dance floor. These local successes created pride, a sense that Detroit was still relevant in the music world even after Motown had left. The Renaissance Center had finally opened in 1977, and its centerpiece, the Detroit Plaza Hotel with its revolving restaurant on the 72nd floor, became a destination for upscale dining and drinks, offering spectacular views of the city and the river. For people with money, this was a sophisticated option, a way to show off Detroit to visitors or celebrate special occasions in style. The Rensen also had shops and restaurants at ground level, though they struggled to attract consistent customers from a downtown that still felt largely abandoned outside of business hours. Construction of Joe Louis Arena was nearing completion in the late 70s. The arena would open in December 1979, giving Detroit a modern sports and entertainment venue right on the riverfront. The Detroit Red Wings would move there from Olympia Stadium, and the arena would also host concerts, bringing major touring acts to a facility designed for both sightlines and sound quality. The opening of Joe Louis Arena was meant to signal that Detroit was still building, still investing in itself, still believing in a future. The contrast between these big, shiny new developments and the conditions in many Detroit neighborhoods was stark. While the Rensen and Joe Louis Arena were rising downtown, residential neighborhoods were struggling with abandoned houses, declining services, and increasing poverty. The investments seemed disconnected from the daily reality for most Detroiters, monuments to corporate vision rather than community need. But they existed nonetheless, physical evidence that some people, at least, still believed Detroit could be saved, could be transformed, could have a future that wasn't just managed decline. For the people dancing in the clubs, though, none of that mattered in the moment. On the dance floor, with the right music playing and the right people around you and the disco ball spinning overhead, you could forget about abandoned houses and crime rates and unemployment. You could lose yourself in movement, and music could feel connected to something larger than your individual troubles, could experience a kind of joy that felt pure and uncomplicated. The clubs were temples of escape, and for a few hours on a Saturday night, that escape was exactly what people needed. The nightlife scene represented Detroit at its best in the late 70s. Diverse, creative, resilient, refusing to let hardship kill joy. The people filling those dance floors were from different backgrounds, different races, different parts of the city, united temporarily by bass lines and disco balls. They were factory workers and secretaries, nurses and teachers, hustlers and students, all mixed together in the democratic space of the dance floor, where what mattered was not who you were during the day, but how you moved and how you looked, and whether you were there to have a good time. That these spaces of joy existed alongside, and despite the problems plaguing the city, wasn't a contradiction. It was human nature, the need to find pleasure and connection even, or especially, in difficult times. The clubs didn't solve Detroit's problems, but they gave people a reason to keep going, a way to blow off steam, a reminder that life could be beautiful and fun and worth living even when so much else seemed to be falling apart.